Even in the summer months, you can watch our livecast every workday at 8:30 p.m. Be inspired and discover new perspectives at Pakhuis de Zwijger.
Good evening and a warm welcome to you. Welcome to the 18th edition of We Make the City Reset, from now on according to Aminata Cairo. My name is Jurgen Chonafong and I will be your moderator for tonight. And a warm welcome for all who are watching us through either the Pakhuis de Zwijger website, Salto, Facebook or YouTube. Tonight, our main guest is Aminata Cairo, who's an independent advisor on diversity and inclusion. It seems that the coronavirus and the crisis that we're experiencing exposed several inequalities. It seems that COVID-19 hit migrant communities more than others. And Marcel Levy, who's the CEO of University College London Hospitals, noticed that black people in Amsterdam and in London were hit and affected more by the virus. What steps should we take to have diversity and inclusivity as an integral part of society? And how can we lift those inequalities? About this and more we will talk with Aminata Cairo. Later in the program, we will be joined by Saran Stewart, who is an associate professor and program director of higher education and student affairs, and a director of global education at the NIAG School of Education. And Saran will join us by Zoom. But first, I would like to welcome our main guest, Aminata Cairo.
Hello, hello.
Aminata, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
You're very welcome.
As an opening question, how did you experience the past months where we experienced the intelligent lockdown, the corona crisis? How was that for you?
Initially, I must be honest, it was quite a relief.
Was it?
Yes. I mean, of course, you know, the fact that people are, you know, there's a possibility of getting sick, that's horrible. But the whole fact that everything came to a standstill and then we had to get quiet and sit down and not run around so much, that was actually pretty good. And then you know, because you know that you work too hard and you do too much and you run around too much. And so now the universe said, okay, sit your behind down and rest. And so in that sense, you know, it was welcoming. And if you're not too much of an extrovert, then it's even nice to have some peace and quiet and just, you know, to get to yourself. So initially, yes, it was good. But after a while, even me, even though I'm introvert, you know, after a while, I was like, okay, you know, you want some connection. Yeah. And then, so that's me personally, but also I have relatives who are elderly, who are vulnerable. So the concern and then have to figure out, you know, who's the point person, who's going to take care, do shopping. That was challenging, but at the same time, you know, it also emphasized the role of family and you know, and we're in this together. And so in that sense, also, it was a good thing that I didn't have to go to work and I could be there for the elderly in my family.
Didn't you worry about the future? Because it affected all layers of society and it turned society and everything that we knew, economy, upside down. Yes. Even education, which is your specialization, was turned upside down by the virus. Were you worried about that or not at all?
Oh, yes, very much. And, you know, and at the time, I really, you know, acknowledged, you know, I still have a paycheck coming in, but especially I have a lot of friends in the arts. You know, and I was worried about, you know, and I know, and I have friends in the arts, and I have friends who cannot afford to stay at home. I can afford to stay at home and I will have an income, but there are people, you know, you just mentioned, you know, in particular, of course, Black people are affected the highest. You know, we are the ones who most have the jobs that you cannot stay at home, right? So you have to go to work. And we are the ones in the caretaking professions. You know, I have a cousin who works in a nursing home. She got COVID, you know, because we are the ones who are taking care of the people who are ill. So yes, so in that sense, I was very concerned and still am, because we don't see them, but we know that they are suffering. We know that they're having, you know, a hard time. And, you know, 1 month, okay, that's nice. 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, you know, what does that do to somebody's household? You know?
And that is also the question, and it's not being answered in a very easy way. Also not if we look into our future as well.
Yes.
Diversity is a very important topic tonight. What is your perception of diversity? What is it?
What is it? So diversity, if you just look at the term itself, diversity in itself, it just means difference, right? So we have a range of differences. However, especially in my field when it comes to education, when we talk about diversity, that's not just what we're talking about. It's not the fact that we have difference, that's nothing new. But the fact that that difference is linked to inequality, right? That's really what we're thinking of when we're talking about diversity. When we want to address it, that's the part we have to address. Not just the difference, but the fact that when you're different from the norm, that has certain implication in terms of your school experience. Yeah.
Right. And the inequality has not been addressed enough, in your opinion?
No.
We will hear about that more later. But one of the things that your presentation is also about is that education shall be the responsibility of courageous people.
Yes.
Some people will argue it already is the responsibility of courageous people. What's the difference or the distinction that you make?
Courage in the sense that we have a lot of information. We've been having a lot of information. We know what to do. To actually do them, to implement them, that takes courage. And so when it comes to that does not happen enough. And it's not because people don't care, but our system is constructed in such a way that there's all kinds of obstacles and barriers for people to push through that. And so they go, oh, well, never mind. And then we go back to the way we've always done it. So even though we want to, we're really interested, but then it's like, but I have to do this, and this, and this, and this. Okay, never mind. Yeah. And so courage in the sense to say, if I do this, there will be repercussion. It might be hard, it might be complicated, it might be difficult, and I'm going to do it anyway.
Right.
That's really what we need.
Right.
I believe. Yes.
I think you're right.
Yes.
Well, like I said, you've prepared a presentation. I would say the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm standing here, as you said, I'm an independent consultant, and I always start by saying that I am a mother, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister, I'm an anthropologist, I'm a psychologist, and I'm in education. And so one of the things that I bring here is this approach from anthropologists, this idea of story. And I switched, like I said, I was trained as a psychologist, but I switched to anthropology because what was important to me was this idea of what is our story, and the fact, in particular for marginalized people, that we tell our own stories. And so as a psychologist, I had the honor to deal with people's stories one-on-one. But when it comes as an anthropologist on a larger scale, what is our story? And so I have this approach. I tend to look at things like, well, what is the story? And how is the story maintained, and how do we change the story? So like I was just saying, there are all kinds of mechanisms. And in anthropology, we call that leveling mechanism. There are all kinds of mechanisms that maintain a certain story. And it's not always to the best interest of everybody. And so what happens is, so for instance, you have a story and you want to change it. Certain things, there will be punishment. Sometimes there will be rewards. There's all kinds of systems that make sure that that story is maintained. And so particularly today, we are talking about, we've had this experience. We've had this experience when it comes to our health. We have this experience that in particular as it relates to COVID, and yes, even though with COVID, something else happened, and that's this whole Black Lives Matter movement. So even though my focus will be mostly on COVID, as far as our experience as a community, we cannot separate that from this social justice movement that also influenced our story. So in terms of what I want to look at is when something like that happens that really brought our story to a halt, and I'm talking about education in particular. What does that mean to our story? What does that mean to the future of our story? How will that change our story? Or, how do we want our story changed based on what we're experiencing now? What are the opportunities for us to hold on perhaps to these shifts and take that into this future? What do we want this story to be? And so like I said, what has happened to us, what has brought our story to a halt is this experience of COVID and subsequently this Black Lives Matter movement. So this movement of social justice. And so there are 4 things in particular when it comes to education that I want to highlight as far as that were affected in terms of our story. So I want to talk a little bit about this idea of the concept of people's life, as far as education, that we really were more in tune with what is your story and what does your life look like. I also want to talk a little bit about the sensitivity to people's health, physical as well as mental health, inequity, and also this idea of grading. So first, again, this whole idea of context of people's lives, of people's stories. And so we tend to look at our students and even as our staff as individuals. You come, you do your job, you come, you do your work, you come, you're in class, and that's it. And now, thanks to COVID, like I was just sharing, it's not just about me, but it's about my mother who's elderly, it's about my auntie who's elderly. So whatever I do, all of a sudden my story, my broader story mattered. And so even for our students who are at home, who are now forced, okay, you have to work at home, and very quickly, everybody, okay, we're going to switch to online classes. Wonderful, great. Does everybody have a laptop at home? How many brothers and sisters do you have? Maybe there's one laptop for 6 children, et cetera, et cetera. So all of a sudden, that life story, that bigger story started to matter. And not just for our students, but for our staff as well. I'm supposed to do my work. I have a 3-year-old, I have an 8-year-old, I have a 10-year-old who are all at home, who are running through while I'm supposed to have these meetings, and I'm supposed to figure out how to teach online. So all of a sudden, that story mattered. And then I'm not even talking about those of us who have elderly relatives that we could no longer see, that we were responsible for, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we could not just talk about education without taking that personal story into consideration. And so the second thing I wanted to talk about is this idea of the sensitivity to our health, to our physical health, to our mental health, the stress level that this brought with us. Of course, we were already vulnerable to COVID itself, but in particular, our mental health is something that came into the forefront. We were cut off from each other. We are social beings. And again, like I said, it was nice in the beginning. It was quiet. I got up. I didn't have to run to the train. I could take my time and fix breakfast, And at least in the Netherlands, we were allowed to go out so I could walk around. Other countries, that was not the case. But after a while, even that social disconnect, it does something to your mental health. When you look on the news and you see people are getting sick, you're scared. You don't know how long it's going to last. All that insecurity does something to your mental health. I have one uncle who was in a nursing home and who suffered from dementia. And when he was cut off from his wife, he deteriorated and he died because he didn't understand a whole lot about him, but he did understand that he no longer could see his wife. That was real. So how this situation affected our physical health and our mental health for our staff, for our students, something else that we were confronted with. Third thing I want to talk to you about is this idea of inequity. Again, very quickly we had to shift from in-class teaching to online teaching, and we adapted, we adjusted. Staff was working. Those who had never taught online were doing their best. And all of a sudden, parents are now at home. They might have 5, 6, 10 different platforms for their children. For some, it worked really well. For some, they were totally overwhelmed, but we figured it out. And yet, not everybody had access to a laptop. Not everybody has access to the internet. Some children would go to the internet, to the library. That's no longer available. All right, and so what we see is that if you have the resources, you do great. But if you don't have all those resources, you get left behind. And so who has access, who gets to participate, who gets left behind is something, again, that was pushed to the forefront. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about this concept of grading. And so grading itself started to motivate students. Grading came about because it was a way to communicate with parents about, this is how your children are doing. And grading was also a way from, if I go from one level to the next as far as our education, it allowed these different educational systems to communicate with each other about students. And in that sense, it served this very specific purpose. There's plenty wrong with grading. Grading has plenty of issues in itself. We already know that right now, grading no longer measures what you're capable of, but grading is more of an indication how many tutoring you might have had, how much extras you might have had to extra classes, et cetera, et cetera. In Oregon, in the United States, because of COVID, for instance, the school district was going to shift from grades to pass or fail credit. It was the parents who resisted. It was the parents who signed a petition stating this: if my child gets pass or fail grade, they will no longer work hard. And so just think about what that means. Think about the message that we have given to our children, to our students, about what grading really means. So it is the parents who say, no, we need that letter grade because our children will have no reason to study hard for a pass or fail grade. So again, grading has its purpose, but it also, has its flaws. And so I want to share a little story from my brother. My brother's actually a teacher, and he shared with me that because of COVID, he said, usually it was like, okay, these are the grades. These children are doing well. Let's look at the problem cases. And then they would sit and discuss the problem cases. And he said, now what we do, we look at each case, case by case. We take into consideration what is their situation at home. Given the COVID situation, what is the situation at home? Are they doing better? Are they doing worse? What might have been an influence for that grade? And so he said, so now we sit and we discuss the child and we take their story into consideration. He said, it's wonderful. It's wonderful. And so again, this link between, looking at this whole person and taking your life into consideration is directly linked to this grading system. And so these four things that I just mentioned when it comes to life consideration, when it comes to sensitivity to physical and mental health, when it comes to inequities, and when it comes to this grading system, these things, because of COVID, they have come in the forefront. But I want to be clear about this. We already know this stuff. These issues were nothing new. We've always known that grading is great, but it has its flaws. We already knew that, our teachers are stressed out. We already knew that our students are stressed out. We already knew that there's inequities and that certain children are being left behind, right? So all of a sudden, because of COVID, these issues that were already there are now pushed to the forefront. And now we really have to deal with them. And so again, what's going to happen when we starting to shift, what can we learn from this situation? When we finally had the chance, like my brother, finally we had the chance to grade our students, and to really deal with them as a person. We never get that time, but now because of COVID, we've been able to do that. So what can we take from this period and take with us into the future? And so again, I want to stress that this is nothing new. This was already there, but for some reason, we have not been able to address them effectively. For some reason, we have not been able to change them. And the reason why, again, going back to anthropology, we have these leveling mechanisms that keep things in place. We have our rewards and punishment systems that keep things in place. And so I talked with my brother. I said, if you were to continue this, if you were to continue grading and working with students like this, what would you need in terms of time? What would you need in terms of resources? And would you be able to get those? And the answer is no, right? And so that's the kind of thing that we have to look at. We have the answers. We know a lot. And so as my time is coming to an end, so as I look to the future, what is it that we need? What can we learn from this COVID period? And also, again, the social justice, because the social justice movement has in particularly, heightened this idea of inequity and inequality when it comes to our educational system, this gap, how our children are being treated, and the fact that our experiences are different depending on, on your background. And so what can we take from this? And I want to keep it simple. Three things. Number one, we have to listen. We have to listen to our teachers. Our teachers know. We have to listen to our teachers. We have to listen to our students. We have to listen to our stories. We have to listen to their experiences and be brave enough to actually listen and take their stories into this new story that we want to create. And then secondly, I come back to this thing of courage. Once you have these stories, once you have listened, to be brave enough to say, if I do this, I'm going to have to break some of these mechanisms. You're going to have to give me time to really sit with a student and spend time to learn what their story is. You cannot give me two minutes per student. You cannot just give me a checklist and say, okay, deliver me some grades, right? You're going to have to change your grading system. You're going to have to change the way we are being evaluated and rewarded. That's what it takes. You really have to start shaking and shifting things from the roots, from the construction that we have of how we do education. And then the last thing in particular, as it comes, and we will talk about this more, when it comes to listening to our students, a lot of these issues, it is our students who are speaking up. It is our students who are demanding more of us as educators. They have energy, they have passion, they need guidance, but they are there, and they are the ones who are forcing us to step up and to do better. So to embrace that energy as opposed to reject them, and to really take that into consideration. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, that is my hope and my wish as we move forward from this period, that we take the good of it, that we take the lessons to actually make some real shift, to be courageous enough to go there and make some changes. Thank you very much.
Aminata, thank you so much. Embrace the energy of the students. I would like to embrace your energy.
Oh, thank you.
Because it's very contagious. But you addressed quite a few difficult topics that I would like to talk about now.
Sure.
Well, the problem is that we have a momentum that caused Black Lives Matter to have its effect globally. Yeah. How can we keep on that momentum, that realization that inequality is there in all of our societies, and that we have to do something about it? Because before you know it, we turn back to what we know, and that momentum is gone. How do we keep on to that?
I think one of the things is the important part is to appreciate the changes that are being made. Every day, some small changes are being made. Because already you can tell people are getting cynical. It's not going to change, because you want to see the big changes. And you don't. And so we have to stop and acknowledge the small changes, the fact that people are open, the fact that people want to, really are ready to engage. And to be sensitive that for some people this is hard, for some people this is new. And so especially those of us who've been in it a long time, it's like, okay, finally, let's go. And then still. Mm-hmm. So how do we, so again, so to be sensitive that some people, they want to, but they're scared and all this. And even if it's a small step, it is still a step, mm-hmm. right? And so I think, and again, and to listen to these young people, I keep telling my teachers, you are not ready for when these students come back to school. What they are ready, and to say like, well, I don't want to get involved. That's no longer an option. You have to do something. You have to be present, be willing, be ready, be willing to make mistakes, be in there.
How do you help people to develop their sensitivities? Because what you notice here as well is that on every layer of society, in every every circle, there has been talk about awareness of the inequalities, awareness connected to ethnicity.
Yes.
But still, some people are afraid to speak out, and yes. they'd rather not say anything, yes. and by that they don't develop their own sensitivity yes. either. How can you help people to not be afraid and develop that sensitivity?
I think you purposely have to, first of all, create spaces where it is safe to talk and even to say, I don't know, or, and that can be done. But you have to be very purposeful about that we're going to create this space. And if we're going to go there, we're really going to go there. And then the fact that we don't all have to agree and we don't also all have to have the same thoughts, but what we're dealing with is the outcome of a very long story. We didn't just all of a sudden get here. This has been in the works for hundreds of years. This has been brewing for how many years? People have been crying out for how many years? So understand that when we create that space, there will be some pain, there will be some tears, there will be like, well, I've waited this long, so I'm not going to say anything, and that's okay too, but still be there, right? Until you are ready. And so to understand all of us that, if you're really going to do this, it cannot be an intellectual exercise, but it's like you really have to be present and be willing, and again, and be brave and bold to step in there.
But at the same time, people don't experience some workplaces to be safe, because yes. what's very topical right now is that there's a cancel culture. You make a mistake and you get canceled
yes.
right away.
Yes.
No, I'm not saying anything whether it's justified or not, but people are afraid of that cancel culture.
Yes.
What is your stance in regard to the cancel culture?
I have this training I developed about inclusivity, and so one of the elements in there, because we just did an evaluation, people said one of the things that's in there is forgiveness. And people are like, I never thought that forgiveness was an issue when it came to inclusivity, right? But that's the one step that we like to, pass by. It's like, not only do you have to forgive every day, all the time, and again and again and again and again. Yeah, people are going to say dumb things. People are going to make mistakes. And to still regard people as people and not just write them off. But again, you purposefully have to remind people of that. And so I see it, as our basic values as human beings. As human beings, we make mistakes. As human beings, we have to learn how to forgive. As human beings, we have to learn how to listen. So you're taking them back to the basics. Basically, as far as how we relate to each other, as far as we want to create a different space, we want to create a new story. But what it requires from you, that you have to listen, you can get angry and all this, but you also have to know how to forgive and still, relate to people as human beings.
Right, so empathy is very key at that development, and you should take everything step by step.
Yeah.
Right. Our guest, Saron Stewart, was suggested by you. Why did you want to invite Saron to take part in this program?
Yeah. Well, she's brilliant, for one. Sometimes you meet people and it's like, oh, there you are, like you just connect. And so as a person, but also in terms of, her skill level, she's an inspiration to me personally and professionally. So when I had a chance and it had to be international, I knew exactly who to ask. And so I was very excited that she was here. So I'm like, yes, she can make it.
And she is here, but before we talk to her, we've got an introductory film to get to know her a little bit.
Yes.
And so we're seeing, even in Jamaica and in the United States, greater racial and ethnic diversities in our classrooms. That classrooms are becoming borderless and thus bound to global context because of migration and online learning. Students are demanding that global issues of race, racism, and intersectionality be centered in the curriculum. They're no longer siloed on the beaches of Montego Bay or in Negril or up in the mountains of Mandeville. They are part of causes when they saw what happened in Parkland, Florida. They are part of causes when they see what happens in Den Haag in the Netherlands. They are part of these causes and they're curious and ripe for these discussions in their classrooms. So what my colleagues and I came up with is critical and inclusive pedagogy. It describes a pedagogy of possibility that enables the creation of transformative, equitable, and identity-affirming learning environments where all students have the chance to learn at the highest level. And diversity is not on the peripheries, but it is central to the learning process.
Saran, a warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. You're the Associate Professor and Program Director of Higher Education and Student Affairs and a Director of Global Education at NIAG School of Education. And you just started that job, didn't you?
I did. Thank you for having me.
And it's quite a strange time for a career change because you moved house from Jamaica to the United States as well.
In all fairness to myself, prior to COVID, I accepted that position, and then, COVID had different plans, but I stayed committed on the task, and I moved in the middle of a pandemic.
How has COVID affected you at this moment?
So similar to Aminata, it has granted many of us that time of stop. Pace yourself, give yourself grace, and observe everything around you, right? So it's given us that. And then, for those of us who have school-age children, it has given us the true ability to claim superwoman, magician, just ungodly powers that we must possess in order for us to be not just mother, which is a whole different magical title, but now we are
the school nurse, the teacher, the cafeteria lady, most days the principal and the dean of discipline. And in any given 5-minute slot, we might switch to those identities and interweave in them. And so COVID has given us so many more titles that, ask a mother at home to run for presidency, because I guarantee you that's how the household looks like.
From first-hand experience, I do recognize what you're saying, but there's also a serious connection to that, because some people already regard this generation who were affected by the COVID crisis in their education as a lost generation, especially if you're not on the regular level of all your classmates. If you're either higher or lower in that ranking, not nice to talk about ranking, you can suffer from that. How do you experience the long-term effects of children who are suffering from that?
Yeah, so what you're speaking about is what some of us are now calling in the scholarship lost learning. And you are absolutely right. The inequity gap, that third point that Aminata spoke about, has increased exponentially, and almost in every single country. Between March and April, there were millions of children out of school. And in most of our nations that are already underdeveloped, you are finding that majority of our students were being left behind. And so the inequality gaps have increased. Now what most of us are trying to figure out is, how do we recover that lost learning? And what we're seeing is that can't really happen, right? Because schools can't safely reopen. And the lost learning is exacerbated in the rural spaces, in the spaces in which poverty is heavily stricken, and within our Black and Brown communities all across the globe. And so as a result of that, you are finding teachers, family members, trying to come up with incredible community-based action items in order to just reduce it. And that grading piece that Aminata spoke about, I really want to touch on it because I think it's critical. She named it basically as the stratification tool. It is the tool in which we group people by rankings, right? By tracking. How can you do that in a current COVID period? But yet we still try. Some schools, of course, or some education systems, those in Europe, for example, such as the French education system, the United Kingdom, for example, had canceled their national examinations at the end of the last school year. However, some nations didn't. The Caribbean nations, for example, did not. We kept them. Yeah. Even though we knew that not all the children were ready to necessarily sit those exams because of the inequality gaps.
But there's also discussion about cancelling the exams, because they are regarded now as COVID degrees, and because you didn't have to work that hard, is the saying. So was it a good choice to cancel them? Because COVID degrees seem to be of a lesser value again than the regular degrees, whatever that might mean. What's your reaction to that?
So I am not a fan of exams. So that's I think if you asked me already, I was all for no exam period. I'll give you an example, right? In the United States, for example, many of the states and many of their districts had cut out their national exams at the various level. The College Board, for the billion-dollar industry of SATs, had to do away with their exams. And guess what? Students still made it into university. So what it is forcing us to do, which a lot of us have argued for, especially Black and Brown persons who are disproportionately ostracized from standardized exams, and somehow we just perform worse. The reality is this has given us a window into an alternative form of assessments, and for us to look at the entire student's performance, right? And the whole student, so a holistic view of their education, rather than looking at time shots and snapshots of how they perform on an exam that has not had accurate, reliable predictive scores on how they will perform later on in life.
If we relate this back to Aminata's story that we just heard, is that she addressed a couple of problems, a lot of problems actually, but a couple I would like to highlight, and that is having more individual assessments of people. But there's also this limited time that teachers have. What I take from her story is that there should be a radical change in how we perceive our educational system, and we should reform that radically. Can you see that as a reality in this day and age, to have the system radically changed?
So I'm a hopeful the glass half full type of person. So absolutely, I think that we should approach this from a radical standpoint. What we will get pushback on is, where is the money coming from to do this, right? Because it is quite costly. The resources needed to do the individual-based assessments are quite costly. But they are 100% absolutely necessary. Our education system, as we currently know it since the industrial age, has failed majority of our students. And those in the upper stratas of learning and the grading system continue to do well. Those in the lower stratas continue to do disproportionately worse. And so the question isn't that these students can't perform, it's what about the system that is not performing for them? And so we always typically try to look at keeping the status quo, because we hear the mantras of it's economically sound and it's standardized and it's going to be a one-size-fits-all. But education is not a one-size-fits-all. And it cannot be if we really want to truly have the system change. And some countries have been doing it, right? We do know of countries that do it well. We do know of education systems that do it well and approach it from a different standpoint. And we do know of a number of systems that are looking into much more grassroots approach and a community-based teaching approach that looks at the holistic student rather than looking at high-stakes testing assessment to place them.
What are the steps in that regard that you're able to take at a NEAC School of Education?
Right. So being back in a very US-based system, it will take some time, because we know within, even in global education situated in the United States, most of the focus is on teacher education, and then you'll have the principalships types of program. The shift that we would have to look at, I'll give you a concrete example. I was talking to you before we had started about my two daughters, right? And they're on the Jamaican education system, which is almost a mirrored image of the British system in some respects, because our curriculum has significantly changed. But what ended up happening last year is that they weren't able to do the schooling system here, weren't able to do the assessments. So when I arrived, I immediately started looking at their data, and they're a great school district. When I started to disaggregate the data, however, based on race, the Black students were performing at least a 20-point differential lower grade rate than any other racial group. And that disturbed me quite a bit, because here I have high-performing students, children coming into their system, but because of their race, is their racial conscious bias in the teaching system that will add to their aptitude to learn and thrive, as they have been doing in another racial context completely. And so there are pieces like that that I've been examining within the US system based on how is the system not inclusive, and how is the learning environment exclusive, especially for Black and brown children to thrive and succeed. And so that's where my focus has traditionally been and will be as I look at access systems, who gets into school, which schools, who recovers from this lost learning period and who does not. And more importantly, for my passion and where I work, where are our Black and brown students situated in that learning curve?
Right. Aminata, back to you, because you have been connected to the Hague University School of Applied Sciences, and you also, one of your tasks were to change that system in order to have people from different ethnicities perform better at school. What advice would you give, Saran, well, while changing the system, because you experienced it is quite difficult to do that?
What advice would I give her to change it where she is right now?
Yeah.
In the U.S.?
Or any system, because school systems are very slow to change.
Yeah.
They don't respond quickly.
No, and so, I mean, one of the things that I'm starting to see clearly is, on the one hand, we are working on, like I said, these basic skills as far as interrelating, listening, connecting. On the other hand, you have to look at the institutional mechanisms that are in place. You know, and I can train people to get along and be nice and all this forever, but if you are not willing to address the policies and the structures that you have that maintain that inequality, we're not going to get anywhere. You know, and our reward systems and our, you know, it is so ingrained. Again, people want to, but when they say, well, this is what it really takes, and this is what it really takes, because, you know, my financial system is tied into this, my reward system is tied into this, you know what, never mind. And then we continue as we always have. So, you know, and so you need to start somewhere to be able to address, you know, to be able to even listen and acknowledge that there's something wrong with your system, right? It's not one child that's falling out, but if 50, 70, 80% of your students keep dropping out or are lagging out every year, you know, it's not the students, it's something about the system. And so there's a lot of personal pride and status and all that, you know, all that starts to play. But also, again, we've been doing it for so long, and the system as it is, even though it's fault, is being maintained. You know, we receive money from this and we receive money from that, and all that plays into that. And so if you really want to really shake that up, you know, you have to be willing to look at what would it require. And to be confident enough, you'll be able to handle it. You know, you'll be able to change it. I mean, there was a time that women were not allowed to go to school. You know, we get over it. You know, I mean, it wasn't like, oh, come on, bring in the girls. I mean, there was plenty of resistance and reasons why not to, but we did it. Yeah. Right. And so similarly.
But that took pressure from different kinds of sides, from different sides. It didn't take just one person in one position to change the whole system around. Right. The pressure and the awareness should come from all different sides to make the things fluid again, in order to change the schooling system. I'll just leave that topic here. But you brought two clips as well, two video clips that we would like to watch. The first one, shall we just watch it, or do you would like to introduce it?
Well, I mean, I always start with explaining the difference as far as, you know, my definition when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And I use the story of my oldest child, and my children love it that I always use them. But this is the story that I generally use to explain the difference between diversity and inclusion.
Let's have a look.
Yes.
And we started in a big basketball arena, very American style. You know, all these first-year students and their parents, and it was a big show. Oh, yeah, you're one of us. Yeah, yeah, we're so happy you're here. All African-American students stand up. Latino students stand up. Asian students, Native Americans, because in the U.S., that's how we do, right? I'm in the Netherlands now. That is not how we do. But in the US, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, right? International students, look at all the diversity we have. And indeed, there was great diversity. It was impressive. Like, yes, my child, go do your thing. 3 weeks later, he calls me up. He said, Ma, guess what? We're studying art history. We're skipping African art. We're skipping Asian art. We're skipping Oceanic art. All we're going to study is European art history. This is the top art institution in the United States, all right? So it's cute that you call out all this diversity that's present. That's nice. But what happens about which story is being told, right? Which story is being told as valuable? Which story is being told as important? Which story is being told as the dominant story, right? And so what we have is that we started with all these stories, and for some reason, there's one story that has risen to the top. Of course, we're going to study this story because this is important. This is valid. And there's nothing wrong with that story. I like that story too. But what happens with all those other stories? Right? And so we have this range of stories, and as one has risen and become dominant, those other stories become less valid, invalid, overlooked, silenced, marginalized, cute, entertaining, oh, if we have some time left over, extracurricular, et cetera, right?
Yeah. Changing the curriculum, that's mainly the thought behind it, and that sometimes people are willing to do that, but it doesn't have to take away from the stories that we already know.
But it's not just about the curriculum. It's not just about the content of the story. It's also about how we do story, right? So this whole dominant and other. So even as far as how we do research, oh, it has to be evidence-based. Well, yeah, okay. There's nothing wrong with evidence-based, but that's just one way of doing research. There's a lot of ways you can do research, but that then has become, well, yeah, if it's not, then it doesn't, so if you don't live up to that norm, then you automatically seen as less. And so that pattern of inequality, it comes back again and again and again, and not just in education, our healthcare, our banking, you name it,
Absolutely.
all our systems, you find that back.
We'll talk about how to change that in the Netherlands, but Saran, you already did that at your previous job. You changed the curriculum, you changed narrative, and you changed stories, and you changed the values that were connected to that. How did you go about it?
With much resistance. But so I'm going to talk about two different sets of changes. One was, there's a couple of things. Aminata's theme around story is critical, because the question about who is the narrator plays a huge role in how the images of diversity and how it plays into later on mental health of underrepresented groups. For a long time in most of our countries, as we know, every syllabus that we would read had the darkest of Africa, right? And what that actually ingrained in many of us of African descent was that there was an undermining Black self-confidence brewing.
What is the darkest of Africa? What does that mean?
The darkness of Africa is in most curriculum that was inherited by our colonial countries. In our case, is the United Kingdom. In Suriname's case would be, for example, the Dutch, the Netherlands, yes. Is that most of the curriculum was being read and taught that anyone of African descent were savage. And those were the terms that were used and ingrained. And then the images, therefore, was not of an intellectual or not of someone being innovative. And so you would always refer to Africa as dark Africa or the darkest Africa, right? Or the dark continent, for example, in some textbooks as well. It wasn't until, for example, after independence for a number of us that we started to decolonize the curriculum and decolonize the teaching. And when that started to happen, it has taken us about 5 decades to do that. Majority of our books within the Caribbean, at least for the most part, the English-speaking Caribbean, are written by and for the nationals of that Caribbean state. That is not, there was an image on the screen just now of some of the books that even my children learn from, right? And it matters because when you think back with your own educational journey and curriculum, think about who you read and who was not written or read about. When you look at the images just on these textbooks, our children are able to see reflections of themselves just on the covers. So they are valued, they matter, and they're edified. They are pilots, they are doctors, they are dentists, right? My children have never known actually any other. And so it matters in their self-confidence and later on in their mental health and well-being and how it persists. When it came to the curriculum at the higher education level, absolutely changed it to infuse more critical and inclusive pedagogy. And that took much of the resistance where you do need leadership buy-in to show equity. But when it came to the national curriculum of the education system, that work started in the 70s and has continued to today where it is standard for us to write our own textbooks and no longer import them from Great Britain, the United States, or even Canada, for example. And it matters with Black majority countries because our self-confidence was completely repleted in most of the textbooks that even I learned by when I was in grade school. And so we take it for granted how much that matters to edify ourselves in these texts, but it matters quite a bit how they learn about slavery, for example, and chattel slavery in particular, and how, all Black people were not enslaved.
Yeah.
And that is taught from a very young age in most of our Caribbean nations today.
Yeah. That step is very important, and especially in Caribbean nations. My parents, for example, were taught by Dutch textbooks about the geography in the Netherlands and not learned about Suriname at all. Aminata, if I look at you, is there a change happening in the curriculum of Dutch schools and in the Dutch education system because of the discussions in society? Is that curriculum, oh my God, I see your face. That doesn't make me very happy.
A little, but again, who's the narrator?
Right, and that,
from whose perspective?
And that's not changing quick enough. Because of time restraints, we have to go to our second video clip, and that says something about the new generations, right?
Yeah. Yes, in particular, again, this energy, from this generation that we have right now, it is the young people who are holding us accountable, and who are saying, I want to be seen, I want to be heard, and who are demanding more of us. So
let's have a look.
Yes.
Young people have helped drive social movements around the world. From protesting the established order to furthering new ideas, youth are often on the front lines of political and social transformations, hoping to make the world a better place. Reasons for youth participation in movements vary. Compared to adults, youth often have larger social networks, which can serve as conduits for the transmission of ideas and mobilization. Young people are also more inclined to be innovative in their use of media. They may adopt the latest technologies to help spread their message and mission. Also, youth may have more time and bandwidth than older generations, giving them a greater chance to take risks and fight the status quo. Altogether, reasons such as these make youth participation in social movements an incredibly powerful element.
Right, this is what we saw at the Black Lives Matter demonstrations here in Amsterdam as well, that there was a group of young people that really were involved in the protest and wanted to bring about change. That generational change is happening through all ages. We just saw that. Yeah. How can we let the people in power, or the generations in power, realize that they have to listen to the voices, realize that they have to listen what the young people have to say? Because they're not often taken very seriously, are they?
No, but the thing is, you cannot not listen. And so the challenge is, it's like, they're just children, they're just young, and the challenge is to take them seriously. And yes, they are young, and some of them, they might not always be the best informed, but they have the commitment, they have the passion, even more reason to join up and to make sure that they get the right information, because they bring the energy that perhaps we older ones, we're a little bit tired by now, but they bring the energy.
But some people say they want it too quickly because we want to change the systems, but the teachers aren't there, or the information isn't there, or the people that can develop the books that will add to the new curriculum, they're not there yet. So, everything will change in time. What would you say to them?
It's complex. You need a little bit of both. You need somebody to keep the fire to your feet. Because it's easy to say, well, be patient, be patient, be patient, be patient. And for instance, even when it comes to, like, you see now, not just in the Netherlands, but I know in Belgium and some other, and in England, they've been knocking over these statues. Now, if we were to wait, there would be a commission who would do a study, which would take another 3 to 5 years. And then we would do another study. And then let's see. Then now it's down. And there's like, because we've been waiting.
Yeah.
And so sometimes that's okay, right? And then we adapt and we adjust. It's like, okay, we're still standing, we're still dealing, we're still handling. And so they have forced us now to do something about that. So with any kind of social movement, it's hard to predict. You know, we like for things to, you know, but sometimes you need people to push you. Sometimes you need to go a little bit slower. But again, if you recognize that we're in this together and we need them and they need us, as opposed to, you know, the young people over here and the other generation over here. So if you, you know, you have to do it together, and we have to take them more seriously.
Right. Saran, that's a question I would like to ask you as well. You just told us that the changing curriculum happened from the 70s onwards, and finally now it recently changed. What advice could you give us here in the Netherlands to make the educational system more inclusive? What can we do?
So I gave a talk in the north of the Netherlands, in Groningen.
Groningen, yeah.
At one of the universities there, and I was telling Aminata that I gave a keynote after Kimberly Crenshaw, who is the foremother of intersectionality theory. And the tapestry behind us was nothing short of a slave tapestry where all the Black enslaved people were at the bottom of the tapestry. And it's a tapestry that's at least, 40 feet high by 20 feet wide, because a magnificent, stately room that was there for 450 years, right? And to see these Black women speak out against the fact that unapologetically that our presence matters, and that it's taken this long to get us in front of this tapestry, that you should rip down the tapestry altogether, right? And you shouldn't even talk about that. That was last summer. Obviously, I highly doubt that they've ripped down the tapestry. They've had one female rector. And I say all of this because the Netherlands has to confront a past that they are most ashamed of. And until they are ready to deal with a past that is not nostalgic, that is barbaric, and that has caused centuries of suffering, where we have been protesting for over 400 years. And those of us that were more successful, for example, like my parents in the 1960s, and that benefited from the process of independence, countries such as the Netherlands that are the colonizers, right? They've never known what it is to truly be colonized by another. And until they confront that raw past on a leadership level, change, sadly, is far from coming, and it will have to be demanded on. As we have seen across the globe, where protests have been happening for centuries and decades, and in our lifetime, the BLM movement started in 2013, 7 years ago. And is getting back life and traction right now. It's nothing new though. But the deaths, the inequities, the murders, the barbarism that was conducted for us to not know ourselves, that was actually the worst form of what currently happens. It's the feeling that we were never supposed to be on platforms like this, that Aminata and I were never to have PhDs, right? How dare they get that? And in many ways, that is our own protest, right? That's our own social movement and adjustment. But for change to come, oftentimes there is a huge sacrifice that must be made. And it's the sacrifice of our mental and health and well-being oftentimes for those of us who are alone in the process. Aminata and I currently are unicorns. I was not before, right? Yeah. We are one of only, or one of few, and they call us unicorns because, you know.
But let's keep the glass half full again. So let's say you're the leaders of a generation to come, and I think that it's very important to have like figures like people like you, to have role models like you that are, and Aminata that can lead the way and show us how we go about it. Because of time restraints, I have to cut you off. I'm so sorry about that.
No problem.
Hopefully we'll meet again in real life later, and hopefully we'll have more time to talk a little bit longer. But thank you so much for now. It was really inspiring to talk to you. Thank you, Saran. And we have to close up here, Aminata, as well. There's a lot has been addressed, and a lot needs to be changed as well in order to bring about that equality. And it has to do with listening to young people, but it also has to do with Saran just said, leadership should be aware of that inequality and should address it and should know about their own history. And I think that if we look at the political leaders at the moment, that there's still some steps to be taken in order to bring about that. Again, thank you so much for your contribution.
Welcome.
And I hope
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome, and I hope to continue this conversation later on as well. Well, for everybody who's watching, our time is up, unfortunately. If you would like to see other live casts, please go to the website of www.dysfunctional.nl. There you can see our programming every Thursday at 8:30. There's a new edition of We Make the City Reset being published on the website, and our next guest will be Philip Blom. Hopefully I'll see you there. If you would like to make a contribution to our program, that's also possible. If you go to www.dysfunctional.nl/pay, you can leave a financial contribution that will benefit the programs directly in these, well, challenging times, let's say. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks again to our guests, and hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.